The morning fog had not yet lifted over Redstone Creek when a woman in a faded gray coat pushed open the door of a roadside diner and asked for a table near the window. She ordered black coffee, 2 eggs, and a slice of toast, speaking softly, almost invisibly, the way people do when they want to be forgotten. Nobody in that diner knew her name. Nobody knew that the quiet woman eating breakfast alone was the newly appointed director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, traveling under no title, no badge in sight, only a notebook tucked beside her plate. Minutes later, the most powerful man in town walked through that same door, glanced at her once, and decided without a single question that she looked like trouble. Before the eyes of dozens of stunned customers, he snapped handcuffs around her wrists in the middle of the diner, smiling as if he had just saved the town from something terrible. He had no idea that the woman he humiliated held more authority than anyone he had ever answered to in his life, and that his own future was about to collapse in front of the very people who once called him a hero. Redstone Creek, Montana, sat quietly at the edge of the mountains, a town so small that everyone recognized everyone else's truck before they recognized the driver. For nearly 20 years, Sheriff Clayton Rohr had been the loudest voice in that town. His name appeared on plaques. His face smiled from the front page of the local paper every autumn. His word was treated less like law enforcement and more like law itself. People trusted him the way people trust a habit, without asking questions. He called it order. Others quietly called it something else, though few dared say so out loud. On that particular morning, none of that history mattered yet, because a stranger's SUV had rolled into town before sunrise and nobody had noticed her arrive. Nyla Monroe was 45, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of woman who noticed exits before she noticed decor. She had been sworn in as director only weeks earlier, and instead of settling behind a desk in Washington, she had chosen to travel unannounced through small towns where complaints about local law enforcement had piled up for years without consequence. She dressed plainly on purpose. No tailored suit, no government vehicle, just a rented car and a worn coat that made her look like anyone else passing through. She wanted to see towns the way ordinary people saw them, not the way officials performed for cameras. Redstone Creek was simply the next stop on a list that had grown far too long, a list folded inside her notebook and updated every time another complaint reached her desk unanswered. Driving in from the highway, she had studied the town from behind the wheel. A boarded storefront near the gas station, a single blinking traffic light, a church sign advertising a bake sale that had clearly already happened. Small towns told their stories in details like these long before anyone opened their mouth to speak. Before she had ever set foot in Redstone Creek, her office had compiled a thin but troubling file on the county. A handful of anonymous letters, 2 unresolved civil complaints filed years apart, and a pattern noted almost in passing by an analyst reviewing arrest statistics across the state. One county consistently detaining more people per capita than any comparable town its size, with almost no cases ever reaching a courtroom. None of it was conclusive alone. Together, it was enough to justify a quiet, unannounced visit, the kind that relied on nothing but patience and a willingness to sit still long enough for the truth to introduce itself. She had learned, long before her appointment, that the most revealing moments rarely happened in interviews or press conferences. They happened in diners, in waiting rooms, in the small unscripted seconds when officials believed no one important was watching. It was why she carried no visible credentials, nothing that might alter the behavior of the people she had come to observe. Inside, a handful of regulars sat scattered across the booths trading small talk about weather and football. Grace Holloway, the owner, moved between tables with a coffee pot, greeting each customer by name, the way she had done for over 20 years. When Nyla stepped in, Grace offered a warm nod and pointed toward the window booth, treating her exactly the way she treated every stranger. Plain, unthinking hospitality that asked no questions. Nyla sat, ordered quietly, and pulled out her notebook. She wrote nothing dramatic, only observations, the pace of the town, the way people spoke to each other, the small signs that told her more than any official report could. She watched farmers in worn jackets, a young mechanic still smelling of motor oil, an elderly couple splitting a single plate of pancakes. She noticed how the room shifted almost imperceptibly whenever a police vehicle rolled past outside, shoulders straightening, voices dropping. Small details, but exactly what she had been trained to catch. Then the door swung open harder than it needed to, and Sheriff Clayton Rohr stepped inside, filling the doorway the way he filled every room he entered. He was 52, built like a man who still believed intimidation was a form of leadership, and he had long since stopped distinguishing between authority and entitlement. His gaze swept the diner, cataloging familiar faces, until it landed on Nyla, a black woman he did not know, sitting alone, writing quietly in a notebook. Something in him tightened immediately, the way it always did when the familiar picture of his town included someone unfamiliar. He didn't approach right away. He stood near the counter, watching her the way a man watches something he's already decided is suspicious. Grace noticed the shift in his posture and felt a twist of unease, though she said nothing. Saying something to Clayton Rohr had never once changed his mind about anything. Deputy Mason Pike, 31, trailed in behind him, carrying the quiet discomfort of someone who had learned to read his boss's mood before it fully formed. The room, easy in ordinary moments earlier, began to tighten. Clayton finally crossed the floor, boots striking the tile with unnecessary weight, and stopped beside Nyla's table. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask permission. He simply planted himself there, arms crossed, studying her the way he studied every stranger who didn't immediately explain their presence to his satisfaction. Nyla looked up calmly, fork still resting on her plate. Conversations around them died down, replaced by the particular silence that falls over a room sensing something is about to happen. Clayton demanded identification, not as a request, but as an order dressed up as one. Nyla set down her fork, met his eyes without flinching, and asked evenly what legal basis gave him the right to demand it. The question landed harder than she intended. Nobody in that diner had ever heard anyone speak to Sheriff Rohr that way, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Clayton's jaw tightened. He fired off questions: why she was in town, who she'd come to see, where she was staying. The way a man fires questions when he wants answers to arrive faster than thought. Nyla answered each with the same unhurried calm, giving him nothing false but nothing more than necessary, careful not to reveal the one detail that would end the confrontation instantly. She wasn't there to end it instantly. She was there to watch exactly how far it would go. Her steadiness seemed to irritate him more than any hesitation could have. Clayton had built his reputation on reading people fast, on trusting his gut over paperwork, and her composure didn't fit the story he'd already begun telling himself. He muttered that innocent people answered questions quickly. That hesitation was its own kind of confession, ignoring that Nyla had hesitated at nothing at all. A few longtime admirers of the sheriff nodded along under their breath, the quiet agreement of people who had spent years assuming his instincts were always right. Grace stepped closer, setting down the coffee pot, reminding Clayton gently that the woman had done nothing but order breakfast. He waved her off without even looking at her. Deputy Mason shifted his weight near the counter, a small uneasy voice in the back of his mind whispering that something didn't sit right, though he said nothing out loud, the way he had said nothing so many times before. Nyla asked once more, calmly and precisely, what legal grounds justified an interrogation over breakfast. It wasn't defiance. It was a simple, exact question that exposed the absence of any real justification the moment it was spoken aloud. Clayton had no clean answer, and the lack of one seemed to inflame him further, as though her calm control were itself the offense. His hand moved toward his belt, and the air in the diner shifted from tense to dangerous in the span of a breath. He announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that he had every right to search her, that suspicious behavior was justification enough in his town, and that he intended to find out exactly who she was one way or another. Nyla did not raise her voice. She did not stand. She simply looked at him, steady and unblinking, and said he was making a mistake he wouldn't be able to undo. Clayton laughed, short and humorless, the laugh of a man who had never once believed the word mistake could apply to him. An older man 2 booths away, a retired mechanic named Earl who had known Clayton since childhood, cleared his throat and suggested quietly that maybe the sheriff should let the woman finish her breakfast in peace. Clayton shot him a look sharp enough to end the suggestion before it left the air, and Earl, like so many others over the years, decided the matter wasn't worth pressing. It was a small moment, barely noticed by most of the diner. But Nyla caught it, filed it away, Another quiet thread in a pattern she was only beginning to pull. She asked him plainly whether he intended to detain her without any charge, without any warrant, based on nothing more than the fact that she was a stranger he didn't recognize. Clayton's silence answered more clearly than words could have. He reached for the cuffs clipped at his belt, the gesture itself a kind of confession that no legal justification existed and none was coming. The cuffs came out fast, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud against the quiet clatter of dishes. Clayton pulled her hands behind her back with more force than the moment required, snapping the cuffs shut with the satisfaction of a man closing a case he'd already decided was solved. Several customers pulled out their phones instinctively, recording without fully understanding why. A few laughed nervously, the uncomfortable laughter of people who didn't know whether to object or simply survive the moment by staying silent, letting the phone in their hand do the objecting for them. Clayton straightened, chest puffed, and announced that this was exactly why Redstone Creek stayed safe, that a sheriff who trusted his instincts was worth more than 100 pages of procedure. Nobody cheered, though a few offered small, uncertain nods. Nyla said nothing. She didn't resist, didn't raise her voice, didn't struggle against the cuffs biting into her wrists. She simply watched him, memorizing every word, every gesture, every face in that room that chose silence over intervention. Grace stood frozen behind the counter, hand pressed to her mouth, torn between the urge to shout and the fear of making things worse. Deputy Mason took a half step forward, some instinct telling him to intervene, but years of deferring to Clayton's judgment held him rooted in place. Clayton gripped Nyla's arm and guided her toward the door, narrating his own heroism to no one in particular, as though the room's silence were agreement rather than shock. Outside, the town looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Quiet streets, parked trucks, a flag hanging still in the windless morning. Clayton walked Nyla toward his patrol car, still talking, still congratulating himself, oblivious to the sound gathering behind him. Low at first, then unmistakable, the deep hum of engines approaching from beyond the edge of town. Deputy Mason was the first to notice the shapes emerging through the thinning fog, 3 black SUVs moving in careful formation, government plates catching the early light. The vehicles rolled to a stop directly in front of the diner, doors opening in near-perfect unison, revealing agents in dark suits moving with practiced efficiency. Clayton froze mid-sentence as one agent stepped forward and asked, in a voice utterly devoid of small talk, where they could find Director Monroe. For a moment Clayton misunderstood entirely, some part of him assuming this must be backup arriving to congratulate him. He straightened his shoulders and announced with satisfaction that he had just apprehended a suspicious individual inside the diner, gesturing toward Nyla, still standing beside him in handcuffs. The lead agent's eyes moved slowly from Clayton's face down to the cuffs and back up, professional blankness cracking into visible disbelief. Deputy Mason felt his stomach drop, a cold understanding beginning to form even before anyone said a confirming word. The agent stepped closer and said, low and precise, that the woman in handcuffs was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and that Clayton had just placed her under arrest without cause, without identification, and without a single legal justification anyone on that street could name. The words landed like a physical blow. Clayton's mouth opened, then closed, his earlier confidence draining from his face as the weight of what he'd done began to settle over him. He laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, insisting it had to be some kind of mistake, refusing to accept that the quiet woman he had humiliated could possibly hold that much authority. The agent didn't argue. He simply dialed a number and held the phone out toward Clayton, a voice from Washington confirming in clipped, unmistakable terms exactly who Nyla Monroe was and exactly how serious the situation had become. Clayton's face went pale, and for the first time in years he had absolutely nothing to say. Mayor Helen Cross arrived minutes later, alerted by a frantic call from inside the diner, her expression shifting from confusion to horror as she took in the federal vehicles, the agents, the handcuffs still locked around the wrists of the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the country. She asked, voice trembling, whether it was true, and the lead agent's flat answer confirmed every fear now settling over the gathered crowd. Grace stood at the diner's entrance watching the man she'd known for 2 decades unravel in real time. A A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of federal vehicles parked along Main Street, something Redstone Creek had never once seen. The earlier nervous laughter had given way to a heavy, uncertain quiet. Nyla finally spoke, calm and almost gentle, instructing the agents to leave the handcuffs exactly as they were for a moment longer. The order confused everyone present, including her own team, but they deferred without question. She turned to face Clayton directly and told him this was not about her comfort or her dignity in that moment, but about something far larger than either of them. Everything since she'd walked into that diner, she explained, had been a test, not of him specifically, but of the entire system he represented. A system that had received complaint after complaint from towns just like this one, complaints that rarely reached anyone with the power to act. She'd wanted to see how a sheriff treated a stranger he assumed had no power, how a deputy behaved when he sensed something wrong but said nothing, how an entire room of witnesses responded when injustice unfolded in plain sight. She ordered the diner's camera footage and Clayton's own body camera recording secured immediately, along with any nearby traffic camera footage. Nothing deleted, nothing edited, nothing quietly lost the way inconvenient evidence so often disappeared. Mayor Cross tried to offer something close to an apology, but Nyla raised a hand gently, silencing her. This wasn't the moment for apologies, she said, but for facts, and facts required documentation, not sentiment. She instructed her team to begin securing Clayton's office and every file connected to his years of service, treating the request not as punishment, but as procedure, the very procedure Clayton himself had ignored for years. By mid-morning, agents moved through the sheriff's office boxing files, copying hard drives, cataloging evidence. What they found in the first hours painted a picture far darker than a single reckless arrest. Reports of unlawful detentions stretching back years, residents held without charge, property seized without warrants, small business owners pressured into silence rather than risk their livelihoods. Deputy Mason sat across from a federal investigator and admitted quietly that he'd wanted to report some of it before, more than once, but fear had always won the argument. Fear of losing his job, of being labeled disloyal in a town too small for second chances. Nobody judged him for the admission. They simply asked him to help now. And for the first time in years he felt the strange relief of choosing courage over comfort. Grace arrived at the temporary federal office that afternoon carrying a small folder of her own, receipts, notes, and dates she'd quietly kept over the years whenever something about Clayton's behavior struck her as wrong. She'd never known what to do with it, convinced to dine. Word spread through Redstone Creek with unusual speed, carried not by gossip, but by something closer to relief. Business owners who'd quietly paid fines they never understood came forward. Families who'd watched relatives detained without explanation finally spoke openly. An elderly rancher named Walter Briggs described an afternoon 2 years earlier when Clayton seized nearly a dozen head of cattle over an undocumented boundary dispute. Cattle never returned, never accounted for. A young couple running the hardware store described being threatened with license revocation after questioning a fine for a violation that didn't exist in any code. A schoolteacher named Diane Foster described being pulled over 3 times in a single month on the same stretch of road, each stop ending without a citation, but leaving her shaking behind the wheel. A traveling salesman recalled being detained overnight on no suspicion in particular, released the next morning with no paperwork, only a warning to drive through town a little faster next time. Investigators noticed a pattern. A disproportionate number of these encounters involved people who didn't match Clayton's mental picture of who belonged. A forensic review of the sheriff's discretionary fund revealed thousands of dollars in seized cash and property never logged through proper channels, some never returned even after charges were dropped or never filed. Investigators found handwritten ledgers hidden in a locked drawer, entries matching no official county report. The most damning evidence surfaced almost by accident. An old hard drive recovered from a storage closet, containing archive footage nobody had reviewed in years. Investigators pieced together recordings of Clayton coercing confessions, threatening witnesses with vague but pointed language, manipulating situations to fit conclusions he'd already decided before any investigation began. One recording, nearly 6 years old, showed Clayton alone with a young man in a holding cell, his voice calm and almost friendly as he explained that a signed statement would make everyone's day easier, that resistance would only prolong an outcome already decided. The young man signed within minutes. The case closed the same week, built entirely on a confession investigators now understood had been engineered rather than earned. Nyla watched the recording once in silence, then ordered it preserved exactly as found. Mayor Cross watched portions of the recovered footage in stunned silence, her earlier defensiveness collapsing into shame. She admitted to investigators that she'd heard whispers over the years, complaints she'd dismissed, choices she'd made to protect the town's image rather than confront an uncomfortable truth. She didn't try to excuse it. She simply acknowledged it, and Nyla noted that acknowledgement was the necessary first step toward repair, though not the last. Under Nyla's direction, an independent investigation was formally opened, separate from local authority entirely. Clayton was suspended immediately, stripped of his badge, weapon, and authority. Records were seized in full. Within days, the man once celebrated on the front page of the local paper had become the subject of a formal criminal inquiry, his name now printed beside words like misconduct and abuse of power. Clayton requested a private conversation with Nyla before formal charges were finalized, and she agreed, curious to hear what remained of the man once the authority had been stripped away. They sat across from each other in a small, sparse room, the silence between them heavier than anything spoken in the diner days earlier. He finally asked why she hadn't simply told him who she was and ended it immediately, sparing them both the spectacle. Nyla answered without hesitation. If she had announced her title the moment he approached, he would have folded instantly. Not out of respect for the law, but out of fear of consequence. And the truth about how he treated ordinary people without power would have stayed hidden exactly the way it always had. Real authority, she said, didn't need to shout to be recognized. It revealed itself most clearly in the moments no one expected to be watched. Clayton sat with that for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not quite remorse yet, but the beginning of understanding. He admitted that the moment he saw her, before she said a word, he had already decided who she was and what she deserved, and that decision, made in less than a second, had unraveled everything he'd built over 20 years. Nyla told him plainly that he had lost long before the handcuffs. The instant prejudice replaced procedure in his mind. Everything after was simply the slow arrival of a consequence already set in motion. He asked whether there was anything he could have done differently once the questioning began. She told him the truth. The moment for a different outcome had passed the second he decided a stranger's face was reason enough for suspicion. It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only honest one, and something in his posture finally accepted it. Before the meeting ended, his voice smaller than she'd heard it all week, he wondered aloud how many other officers in how many other towns were making the exact same decision in the exact same instant, without anyone ever arriving to stop them. Nyla didn't offer comfort. That wasn't what the question deserved. She told him that was precisely why her office existed, why she chose to spend her mornings sitting quietly in diners instead of behind a desk. The only way to find those moments was to be present for them before anyone had reason to hide them. At the door, she paused and told him one final thing, not as director to sheriff, but as one person speaking honestly to another. Most people who abuse power don't think of themselves as villains. Clayton likely still believed he'd only ever been trying to keep his town safe. The tragedy wasn't that he was cruel by nature, but that he'd never once been required to ask whether his instincts were fair, and by the time anyone asked for him, the damage had already reached far beyond a single diner booth. Deputy Mason, informed of the conversation later, made his decision without hesitation, agreeing to cooperate fully with the investigation. Testimony, records, first-hand accounts of patterns he had witnessed but never challenged. It wasn't easy in a town where loyalty had long been mistaken for silence, but something in him settled the moment he made it. He spent 2 full days walking investigators through incidents he'd tried for years to forget. A traffic stop that never should have ended in arrest, a report he'd been told to file differently than what he'd witnessed, a night he'd lain awake wondering whether he should have said something and never did. Each memory came out slowly, reluctantly, but once the first surfaced, the rest followed with less resistance. A community meeting. Clayton was escorted from town under quiet federal custody that same week, facing a growing list of charges tied to years of documented misconduct. Deputy Mason was appointed acting sheriff on an interim basis, met with cautious optimism rather than celebration. Grace reopened her diner days later, wiping down the same window booth where it had all begun, uncertain whether anyone would return. To her relief, the tables filled again, slowly at first, then steadily, as the town found the rhythm of ordinary mornings again. Nyla returned to that same diner one final time before leaving Redstone Creek, sliding into the same window booth, ordering the exact same breakfast: black coffee, 2 eggs, a slice of toast. As she settled in, the room shifted immediately, recognition sweeping through customers old and new. One by one, without anyone directing them to, people rose quietly to their feet. Not deference to her title, not performance for cameras that weren't even there, but something quieter, acknowledgement of the composure she'd carried through every moment of humiliation, the steadiness that had exposed a truth the town had avoided facing for years. Grace poured her coffee with hands that trembled slightly, this time from gratitude rather than fear. An elderly woman 2 tables away whispered to her husband that she wished she'd said something that first morning, that she'd sat in that very booth and watched it all happen without ever opening her mouth. Nyla overheard, as she overheard most things, and offered the woman a small, understanding nod rather than words of forgiveness or blame, absolving anyone of their silence, she believed, was not her place. That was a debt each person owed only to themselves. She finished her breakfast in the same unhurried silence she'd arrived with, thanked Grace by name, and walked out into a morning far clearer than the fog-covered one that had greeted her on arrival. Within minutes, she was gone, disappearing down the same quiet road that had carried her into town, leaving behind a place that would never again mistake a badge for permission. In the months that followed, Clayton faced a lengthy federal investigation. The badge he'd once worn with careless pride replaced by a case file thick with documented abuse, witness statements, and recovered footage no attorney could argue away. Redstone Creek's law enforcement system underwent significant reform. Oversight tightened, procedures rewritten, accountability finally given real teeth. The town slowly began to understand a lesson it had avoided for far too long. A badge doesn't grant power beyond the law, only the responsibility to uphold it faithfully, and silence, however comfortable, is never truly neutral. Mason, settling into his new role, made a quiet promise to himself that no complaint filed in his office would ever again disappear into a drawer. He began holding open office hours twice a week, sitting across a plain table from anyone who wanted to speak, listening more than he talked, writing everything down whether or not it seemed important at first glance. Slowly, residents began to trust the process again, not because they were told to, but because they watched it work. Grace kept a photograph behind her counter from that autumn. Nothing dramatic, just a small printed image of the empty window booth taken on an ordinary afternoon, a quiet reminder to herself of how easily comfort could curdle into complicity if no one paid attention. She never explained it to customers who asked, only smiled, and said it reminded her to keep her eyes open. Nyla Monroe left no farewell speech behind, no dramatic final statement, only the quiet example of a single unhurried morning that had unraveled years of hidden injustice. She moved on to the next town on her list, unnoticed, unannounced, carrying nothing but a notebook and the same plain gray coat, ready once again to sit quietly in some other diner, order breakfast, and simply watch. Somewhere down another highway, in another small town that hadn't yet learned to question, a similar morning was already waiting to unfold. Another quiet stranger about to sit down at another window booth, another sheriff about to make a decision he didn't yet know would define him. Because true justice, she understood better than most, rarely arrives with noise. It arrives quietly, patiently, and it never answers to a badge worn without conscience.